All right, class. So what we're going to do is we're going to discuss our first, we're going to go into our first venture in ethics, ethical theories. So if you'll remember from the last lecture, we actually made pretty clear that moral relativism, as you see on the slide here, is not exactly an ethical theory, meaning it's really more an amoral theory. Again, from the Greek prefix there, the negation of just like where we get the term atheist or agnostic, right? Without God or without knowledge, or no God or no knowledge. Those two terms use that specific Greek prefix. But we're using it in the sense of ethical theories here, right? So it's moral relativism is an amoral theory, meaning that, again, if you remember from the last lecture, that it's descriptive, right? So it's looking at different cultures, it's looking at different and even perhaps individuals, and it's noticing or picking up on certain behaviors, certain activities, and from that it's deriving from those observations, rather, that there just is no absolute or objective morality. Now, let's just go ahead and say when we say absolute or objective morality, really what we mean is there's something transcendent, right? That there's something that binds or that all humans are obligated to obey, whether that be some sort of divine command theory that we'll look at, or whether it be something like utilitarianism, or virtue theory, or natural law, whatever the case may be. There's just nothing like that that really objectively exists. There's no real standard by which people can judge their behavior that's outside of themselves. So moral relativism is one of the, if not the most prevalent belief systems in regard to morality, probably on college campuses today, even really among the student body, and even probably this is true in regards to most high school students. So for instance, I teach also at a college, a public community college, and most of the students that come into, say, one of my philosophy classes hold to some idea or some ideology that's related to moral relativism when we talk about ethics, right? At the beginning of the course, I may ask some sort of general question, is there anything that's really right for all people at all places at all times? Is there certain behaviors that are just wrong no matter who does them or why they do them? That kind of thing. And most of them have a very hard time answering in the affirmative in that sense. Most of them say, well, it may be right for you, but it's not necessarily right for somebody else, and blah, blah, blah. That's moral relativism. If something is just right for you, but it may not be right for other people, there's nothing really that is right for all people at all places at all times. It's just, dependent upon their culture, which would be cultural relativism, right, which we'll look at, sometimes called conventionalism. So let's go ahead and start looking through some of these. If we can get this to work here. This seems to be all right, there we go. All right, so before we look at moral relativism, some of the possible problems or critiques of that system, let's look at some of the positives of moral relativism. So if you need to, pause this lecture and think of maybe some of the positives that moral relativism is at least supposed to, in theory, offer, right? If there is no objective right or wrong, right? If there is no absolute right or wrong, and I'm using those words interchangeably, but technically you could use those. They don't necessarily mean exactly the same thing, but they do both imply that there's something over and above just human opinion or human subjectivity in regards to thinking through ethical decisions. I'll use them. You'll hear me use them roughly interchangeably, even though technically speaking they're not necessarily completely interchangeable, but they do both speak to something outside and above each individual human preference. So having said that, if there exists no objective or absolute standard of behavior, then what might be a positive of that? Right? Again, try to think like maybe a high school student. Try to think maybe of like an incoming college freshman. Well, is it possible that if, hey, look, what's right for me may not be right for you? If this culture does this and this culture does this, is it possible that that kind of, helps promote tolerance? Like, look, man, if there's no, set morality that everyone has to obey, well, then maybe that helps us to tolerate each other a little better because, hey, look, I can't expect you to live by my ethical, what I consider to be ethical behavior, right? Maybe you have something a little different. And that way, also, you can't necessarily expect me to live by what you think's right. Hey, look, you get to do what you want to do in your own house and wherever, and I get to do what I want to do in my own house, and we can both just be peaceable and tolerate each other. I can tolerate your beliefs, your moral beliefs, and you can tolerate my moral beliefs. Hey, you can't impose your ethical views or your religious views or whatever the case may be. You can't impose those on me, and I can't impose mine on you. So we can just kind of live at peace. Maybe moral relativism is supposed to help something like that, right? Maybe moral relativism is supposed to help people get along better, so to speak. Or, maybe that moral relativism, if we're looking at something like cultural relativism, conventionalism, maybe this helps cultures get along, right? So look, you do that in your culture, we do this in our culture, we won't mess with you, you don't mess with us, this is our, we've got these cultural differences, right? And maybe moral relativism, we can look at that and we can say, hey, look, since we've got these differences and there's not anything absolutely or objectively right or wrong, well, then this helps us to tolerate one another because your culture can do what you want, we can do what we want, right? And again, it's not right to impose your morality on me, or maybe it's not right for your culture to impose its morality on me, in my culture. So maybe moral relativism is supposed to help give us something like that. Now, you've got somebody like here in your PowerPoint, Faye Waddleton and Ruth Benedict, who argues for something like, or at least the implication of what they're saying is something like moral relativism, whether it be individualistic or whether it be cultural. Now, we don't necessarily have time to look at the Ruth Benedict passage. I want you to do that when you can. You can easily Google Ruth Benedict passage or Ruth Benedict moral relativism, or you may find it in your handouts there, the actual passage itself. But what we will do is we'll go ahead and look at the Faye Waddleton passage, and I've pulled this off the excellent website of Stand to Reason, STR. If you have any free time in the future, I would highly suggest you peruse their website, peruse their resources and materials, just good quality stuff. So let's look at this very quickly, this passage here. And I'll just read, you can follow this along on the screen. Again, this is off the STR website. It's called the actual title of this particular piece is called The Myth of Moral Neutrality. So one of the alleged virtues of relativism is its emphasis on tolerance, right? So this is exactly what we've just stated here. An extremely articulate example of this point of view is written by Faye Waddleton, the former president of Planned Parenthood. The piece is called Self-Definition Morality. And here it goes. Faye Waddleton writes, like most parents, I think that a sense of moral responsibility is one of the greatest gifts I can give my child. But teaching morality doesn't mean imposing my moral values on others. It means sharing wisdom, giving reasons for believing as I do, and then trusting others to think and judge for themselves. All right, so far, again, there's some rhetorical power here, right? This sounds good on the surface, right? My parents' morals were deeply rooted in religious conviction, but tempered by tolerance, the essence of which is respect for other people's views. They taught me that reasonable people may differ on moral issues, and that fundamental respect for others is morality of the highest order. I have devoted my career to ensuring a world in which my daughter, Felicia, can inherit that legacy. I hope the tolerance and respect I show her as a parent is reinforced by the work she sees me doing every day, fighting for the right of all individuals to make their own moral decisions about childbearing. So see, this is in the context of Planned Parenthood stuff. You can just forget that for the moment if you want and put this in the context of anything else, right? It could be, whatever. Again, just whatever particular behavior. 75 years ago, Margaret Sanger founded Planned Parenthood to liberate individuals from the mighty engines of repression. As she wrote, quote, "The men and women of America are demanding that they be allowed to mold their lives not at the arbitrary command of church or state, but as their conscience and judgment may dictate. I'm proud to continue that struggle to defend the rights of all people in their own beliefs. When others try to inflict their views on me, my daughter, or anyone else, that's not morality. It's tyranny, it's unfair, and it's un-American." All right, so at least at the onset, that sounds as if, there's some quality stuff there, right? That sounds like, okay, yeah, that may actually be right. And I'm going to go ahead and tip my card here. Kukul writes here at the bottom, I think it's Kukul that authored this piece. He says, "This is impressively and persuasively written." I think we can agree with that. "One of the finest expressions of this view available in the space of 5 short paragraphs." I think that we can certainly agree with that. "It sounds so sensible, so reasonable, so tolerant, but there's a fundamental flaw." Now, we're not going to look at those flaws yet. We're about to. I'm not sure if he lists those in that particular article, but we're going to critique and look at some of the problems with moral relativism. Even though on the surface, as we've already mentioned, it sounds like it may be a good idea, right? So let's distinguish these first. You've got relativism. So you've got I say relativism. Again, this is what thinkers like Greg Koukl, philosopher Frank Beckwith would call something like an individualistic type relativism, meaning that it's literally up to each individual. So again, hence I say, it's up to each individual to determine what's right and wrong for themselves, right? It's wrong for you, whoever's watching this particular lecture, it's wrong for you to impose your moral view on me. I dictate my own morality, and at the end of the day, when I lay my head down at night, if I can answer clean to my conscience, then hey, that's what I'm responsible for, right? And same for you. We can't expect each other to impose each other's morality on each other. I do my thing, you do your thing, let's leave each other alone. Now, excuse me, there's a second type of moral relativism that may be called conventionalism, or society says, right? So society says, if we dub it that way, as Greg Koukl and Beckwith like to state it, this is something, again, like your society, hence society says. What your society says helps determine right or wrong, or conventionalism. It's based upon the convention of the people, right? And we'll look at these. Now, let's get our PowerPoint back rolling. All right. So I want to go ahead and say right off the bat, I rarely do this, but I want to go ahead and lay my cards. If you're familiar with playing cards, you hold your cards close because you don't want people to see necessarily where you stand. You don't want to tip your hand, right? Literally tip your hand. You don't want people to see. In fact, here's an Uno card right here. It's one of my kids' Uno cards, right? So I hold these close because I don't want people to see what I have, right? Well, this is one of the few instances where I'm literally going to go ahead right around and just show you where I stand on this issue. I'm going to show you my hand here. Moral relativism is one of the most abysmal, atrocious, terrible ideologies that has ever come across the face of this planet. And if there's life elsewhere, the universe. This is awful. The logical implications of a system like moral relativism does not, let me just go ahead and make it very clear, and we'll look at why. It does not offer any of the positives that we just went through that it's supposed to even try to offer. It cannot ground them metaphysically or ontologically. It cannot establish exactly these supposed positive these benefits that it tries to display. It can't give you that. So what I want to try to do is lay out a case, regardless of what side of the aisle you stand on, and as it pertains to anything else, that you ought not be a moral relativist, right? That you just should not hold to moral relativism. So let's look at this. Look at your PowerPoint. Forcible rape against a child is a moral wrong that must be eliminated, versus vanilla ice cream is very tasty. All right, well, what does that mean? What is that saying right there? Well, think about it. If there are objective truths, right, objective truths then the truth of a particular matter, in this case, in particular matter, excuse me, in this case, having to do with morality, so if they're objective moral truths, then it's not you, right, or me that makes that true, right? It's not you that makes it true that the earth is spherical, right, as opposed to flat. The earth is what it is. It doesn't matter what you believe, regardless of what you believe about the shape of the earth, it is what it is. So the truth of that, the truth of the earth being spherical or whatnot, is what it is regardless of what you believe about it. Right? That's just what it means to say that it's objective. So the truth is in the object out there, not in you. Now, vanilla ice cream is very tasty. The subject, you, that's a subjective truth. The subject is what makes that true, right? Because to somebody else, vanilla ice cream may be terrible, right? It may be true for somebody else that vanilla ice cream is terrible, but for you, it's very tasty, right? So that's a subjective truth because it's you, the subject, that makes that true. It's not in the thing out there. It's your matter of perception or opinion that makes that true for you, right? Now, here's the connection here. If morality is like that, first what we're doing is we're looking at I say relativism, right? Just complete individualistic relativism. If it's me that determines right and wrong, right, then that's exactly like saying it's my opinion that vanilla ice cream is very tasty. So, it may be wrong for you to beat up innocent people, but I want to do that. That's right for me. Who are you to say? Who are you to judge? You can't judge me, right? In fact, this is what we all say all the time, thou shalt not judge. Completely taken out of context, completely misquoted. But something like that, hey, thou shalt not judge. You can't judge, what I do. And if it's wrong for you to not, punch little old ladies in the face as they walk across the street, well then, hey, that's not right for you. But you cannot say that's not right for me. Because if moral relativism is true, if there are no absolute or objective moral truths, then it's just up to the person to decide what's right or wrong, right? There just is no true, absolute, or objective right or wrong under moral relativism. It's just the person, right, that decides right or wrong, or the society, as we'll look at later. So, what I want you to understand right now is that philosophically, these are equivalent. Let me see if I can. This right here, these are equivalent to one another. Forcible rape against a child is a moral wrong that must be eliminated is equivalent to saying that vanilla ice cream is very tasty, meaning that those are just both your opinion. Think about that. Pause this if you need to. Think about that. Those both amount to an opinion if moral relativism is true. If moral relativism is true, there's no real rights, no real wrongs, then what you think is right is literally just your opinion. And to say that raping a child or any atrocious or heinous act that would normally be dubbed as atrocious or heinous is not really objectively or absolutely wrong. It's just wrong because you feel that it's wrong. It's like saying, I like Cheerios and you like Honey Nut Cheerios. I like vanilla ice cream, you like Rocky Road ice cream, you like chocolate ice cream. I like this, you like that. Right? Again, this can't be stressed. I can't stress this enough, that this first premise here is philosophically equivalent to the second, if there just are no objective, absolute rights and wrongs. Philosophically, these are equivalent because moral relativism makes morality just your own subjective opinion, right? Now, you might say, well, I don't like if other people do, say, this particular action, say, print the first proposition here. But again, think about it, guys. That's just like saying, I don't like broccoli, and I don't like it that you don't like broccoli, but I can't say that it's right or wrong. Now, before we go into any particular ethical theory, as we're going to do throughout the remainder of the course, not today, but throughout the remainder of the course, is it plausible that say your first proposition here, that forcible rape against a child is a moral wrong that must be eliminated, is it plausible that that's literally just an opinion? Now, we're going to go, and that it's equivalent to, hey, I like vanilla ice cream. We're going to look at ethical theories later, right, and try to wrestle through this philosophically and intellectually. But I'm going to tell you right now that this is a pretty bold statement. But you don't need a philosopher, right, like me with a degree, graduate degree in philosophy. You don't need that to tell you that that first proposition is absolutely correct. If you're not sure about that, then you may not necessarily need a philosopher, as I believe Kugel and Beckwith say that. It may be them that say this. They say, I think it's them, they say, you don't need a philosopher, you need a psychologist, right, or a counselor. Now, having said that, we are going to go through philosophical arguments later throughout the remainder of the course, but this is something I want us to recognize right off the bat, that this is the radical claim of moral relativism, is that these two statements are philosophically equivalent to one another. Now, here's a little picture, and you can see the credits, the source of credit right here at the bottom and under the picture itself. Do you need an argument? Are you willing to hold to the claim that moral relativism says that this right here, this picture that you're looking at on your slideshow, on your PowerPoint here, that this little girl here, whatever has happened, right? I don't even want to talk about that. Whatever has happened to this little girl here is literally, again, think about this, that there's no moral difference, morally speaking, because moral relativism is true. If moral relativism is true, then it's up to the person to decide what's right and wrong for themselves. That the person that does this, whatever this is to a child, that it's no different versus this. Let that sink in. Is there truly no difference between what this man is doing to his little girl as opposed to what some individual does to this little girl? Is there no difference between this and this? Really? Is that plausible? Now, again, if moral relativism is true, you may say, well, look, yeah, I like this second picture better, and that's right for me, and I don't like that somebody would do the other. No, again, nobody cares that you like Cheerios as opposed to Honey Nut Cheerios. That's just an opinion. Is that really what you're willing to say, right? Now, let's keep going here. Let's look at the implications of, I say, or totally individualistic moral relativism, that what's right and wrong is determined by each individual person, and they're the ones who have to answer to their conscience at the end of the day. That it's just what they decide is right or wrong for themselves, and it's just up to the person. Let's look at some of the implications of these. And again, this is where we give, credit to, I believe it's Kugel and Beckwith here that make some of these observations. The first is this. 1, relativists can't accuse others of wrongdoing. Why not? If moral relativism is true, why can't a relativist accuse other people of doing anything truly, in the robust sense of the word, wrong? Why can't they accuse anyone else of doing anything wrong? Pause, and again, if you need to, pause, think about it. All right? Think about it, guys. They can't say somebody else is doing something wrong because the other person can say, what? That's just wrong for you. It may be wrong for you to do that, but it's not wrong for me, right? Again, it may be vanilla ice cream may be terrible to you, but to me, chocolate ice cream is awesome, right? And your preference is terrible for me. Maybe right for you, terrible for me. Because again, I just can't emphasize this enough. Moral relativism is claiming, again, that there just is no objective standard over and above people that we judge our behavior by. It's just you, right, that decides right and wrong. But here's the first odd implication. In fact, what we're doing here is what's called a reductio ad absurdum argument. All these observations or these implications of moral relativism are basically what we would call in philosophy a reductio ad absurdum type argument, meaning you're reducing to the absurd, right? You're trying to show the absurd conclusions of some particular position, right? Either they're contradictory or they're absurd. And absurd in the philosophical sense, meaning they make no sense whatsoever, or they're just so radically implausible that it can't possibly be true. So the first is that relativists can't accuse others of wrongdoing. Now they can say, you're doing wrong according to my own view, but again, that's like saying, hey, it's right, broccoli tastes terrible. Well, it just doesn't matter if the other person likes it, right? It just doesn't matter what your own opinion is, right? All right, so what's the second implication? Relativists can't complain about the problem of objective evil. What do we mean by that? You can't look around at the world, right? You can't look around at the world and say, look at all this injustice, look at all this unfairness, look at the way things are as opposed to the way things ought to be. Because again, if moral relativism is true, there's just no way things ought to be. Remember, you've erased the transcendent standard over and above humanity, right? There just is no way. There is no standard that human behavior is being judged by other than each individual person, right? They answer to themselves. And if they want to perform a certain action, then, well, again, it's just that person who they have to answer to, their own self, so to speak. So you can't say, if you're a moral relativist, that there's any sort of objective or something that's truly right or wrong, truly evil. So for instance, if you see genocide, right, or you see something on the evening news, something of, like a Holocaust, you can't say, well, that's really wrong because it's just wrong for me, but for the people perpetrating those particular crimes or those particular acts, it may be right for them. In fact, they probably do think that that's right. They think they're doing the right thing, so who am I to say? Again, I want you to see the absurdity of this view. Right now, at the time of this recording, we're witnessing these school shootings, right? Not just at high schools, but little children. If you can't look at that and say, I don't care what your opinion on the matter is, I don't care what you think, that's wrong, right? It's wrong, absolutely, or objectively, it's wrong. They're breaking some real standard of morality by going into a school and doing this, right? Or are you willing to say, well, I just personally don't like it, but that person that goes in there, hey, they like Brussels sprouts, I don't. Really? Really? And think about this. This may come up in a moment, but while we're on the subject of this objective evil, or absolute right or wrong, you can't complain, a moral relativist can't complain that God, if an argument, say, against some sort of theism is if one of their arguments against, say, some sort of theistic belief, say in Judaism or Christianity or even Islam or whatever, they can't even complain that quote-unquote God is evil because, again, there's just no such thing as true, right, and wrong. Again, they're just espousing their own opinion, and the person they're arguing against could just as easily say, well, that's just wrong for you, but not wrong for me. That's completely fine. And their argument is flushed down the toilet. They don't have any solid ground to stand on by which to levy the claim that, quote unquote, if there's a God, that he's evil, right? That he's wrong for doing what he does. Because again, they've erased the standard. There is no standard of right and wrong. It's all washed away. It's just determined by the individual. Now, here's another, again, trying to reduce to the absurd implication of moral relativism, specifically I say, or subjective moral relativism. A relativist can't place blame for any sort of action, right? Because blame assumes that they've done something that's either unfair or unjust or right or wrong in terms of moral connotations, right? You can't say, well, you did this and I'm angry with you. And blah, blah, blah. Well, again, the person can simply say, well, that's just right for you, but not right for me, right? Or that's wrong for you, but that's not wrong for me. There's no robust sense of the word blame. There's no robust sense of moral accountability because, again, They're just answering to their own subjective preferences at the end of the day, right? You're just answering to your own subjective preference, and I'm just answering to my own subjective preference. And when you blame me, I can literally dismiss that as again, your opinion. It's just your opinion, right? That milk is not tasty, right? That's just your opinion. I like it. You don't like it. Whatever I did and you're blaming me, all right, whatever. You don't like it, I like it. Think about it. So, for instance, imagine a father and a mother who obviously come together in their marital union and they produce a child. Let's say during the marital union or during the gestation period, the 9-month period there, let's say that the mother decides to, snort crack and drink and smoke and blah, 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 whatever she wants to do, just whatever, right? And let's say that the child, heaven forbid, is born with all of these disabilities, right? Just the mother's actions, the mother's choices have completely devastated the child's anatomy and physiology, right? Its biological composition there, whatever that means. Now imagine that happens. The dad, let's say if he's a moral relativist and the mom's a moral relativist, he can't even blame her for doing anything wrong. He can't say, you've done something to our child. Look at what you've done. This is wrong. The mom can say, well, look, that's just wrong for you, but it's not wrong for me. I wanted to live my particular lifestyle, and you can't impose your moral views on me. Now, you can say that the mom is responsible, right? Just and in the same sense that you would say something like an antecedent and consequent, right? Like a mathematical equation there. Like you put 1 and 1 together when they make, whatever it is. Now there's 2 of them. You can say that it's responsible in that sense, but you can't say that it's morally. You can't say the mother is morally responsible because, again, you've erased, if you're a moral relativist, you've erased that standard of behavior that people ought to behave in accord with, right? Excuse me. Now, again, an additional irony of that is they can't accept praise. See, here's one of the very odd things is the moral relativists will consistently run around and say you can't impose your morality. You can't, what's right for you may not be right for others. What's wrong for you may not be wrong for others, blah, blah, blah. But then they'll turn around and if they do something right, what is usually seen as praiseworthy, they'll accept praise as if they've truly done something that's truly good, right? Not just an opinion of a bunch of people, right? So imagine a soldier who has thrown himself on a grenade, which has really happened. Even as recently as the Middle Eastern conflicts over here. Soldier has thrown himself on a grenade, and his family, and let's say he receives the Medal of Honor, again, which has really happened, after his death and is given to his family. But what if the family of that particular soldier believe in moral relativism? They would most likely take that on behalf of their son and truly think that their child has done something praiseworthy, morally significant, truly good. But if moral relativism is true, it's no different than if he would have just picked up the grenade and threw it in the pile of his buddies instead, save his own life, because hey, that's right for him. What's right for you is right for you, what's right for me is right for me. Again, now here is where we start to see the inconsistency of those that espouse the ideology of moral relativism. We start to see the inconsistency. In philosophy, we would call this something like existentially unviable, meaning they can't live consistently with their own view. It's existentially unviable. They can't live with the view that they're supposedly espousing, right? Needless to say, even if they do let's say they do bite the bullet, they try to live consistency. Is that plausible? Say that the young man who's thrown himself on the grenade to save his buddies, right? Well, he hasn't really done anything more right or wrong if he did done the opposite. There's no difference between the two, logically, if moral relativism is true. Now, we've already looked at this as we kind of talked about the problem of objective evil. But think about this. Relativists, again, moral relativists, can't claim that anything is unfair or unjust. Again, because if they do, it's just what? It's just unfair or unjust according to who? Their own personal subjective feelings. Again, it's like saying, it's not right that all of you people like Brussels sprouts cooked in the oven as opposed to on the grill in tinfoil, right? It's just their opinion. But they can't consistently claim that there's some real standard of justice that has been broken or that's not being held up or lived in accord with, because again, they've erased that standard already by claiming that morality is only and solely dependent upon each individual person's preference, right? Think a lot of the, at the time of this recording, there's a lot of advocacy for social justice type issues. Now, can you be a social justice type pioneer or whatnot and hold to moral relativism? No, because you think there's a real standard by which people ought to be living by, but you've erased that and you're still saying that society or whatever the case may be is unfair or unjust, right? C.S. Lewis, I think, gives the example of, imagine two men, and this is roughly the example, that say two men are on an island, right, and one stumbles upon some fruit, right, and they are in danger of dying of dysentery, right, lack of vitamin C. One stumbles on some sort of oranges or whatever, and he finds them, and he says, all right, I'm going to give some of these oranges to my fellow, lost at sea buddy over here, keep him from dying from dysentery, right? So they share the oranges, and say a few months go by, the problem comes up again. Man, we don't have any of this fruit. We're going to die of malnutrition, lack of vitamins. And the other buddy, let's say the other guy, now he stumbles upon some sort of tree that produces either, oranges or bananas or whatnot. And the other person says, hey, thank goodness you found these. Will you please share these with me as I shared them with you? And the guy says, no, I'm not sharing them with you. He's like, but I'll die if you don't give me these. And so the guy says, well, what's right for you is right for you. What's wrong for you may not be wrong for me. And the guy says, well, that's not unfair. Or the guy says, that's unfair. That's not just. That's unfair. I shared with you. But if moral relativism is true, let's say they're both moral relativists. He's like, right, but that just may be fair for you, but it's not fair for me because at the end of the day, I think that I'm doing the right thing, keeping myself alive for longer and letting you be gone, right? If moral relativism is true, then neither one can claim that what's happening is unfair or unjust. Is that plausible? Now, one of the next difficulties is that, think about this, again, if there's no standard, then a relativist literally cannot improve their morality. Why? Well, because when you improve your morality, you're assuming a standard that doesn't change, right? That you're approaching some better state of behavior than what you had previously been enacting or doing or performing, whatever. But remember, if moral relativism is true, there just is no standard or unchanging, absolute or objective moral law that you ought to be obeying. It's just determined by you, right? So if one day you decide to do this, but then the next day you say, hey, you know what, I don't think that's right for me, I'll do this over here. Well, then you're not judging your behavior by any sort of outside standard. You're just literally changing your behavior because, hey, the other day you thought it was right, so that made it right? It's just determined by your own subjective preferences. Well, today you think it's wrong, so now it's wrong. But notice that your behavior is not any better or worse in any moral connotation of the term, any moral sense of the term, because it's just you that determine it, right? And if you determine it, the goalposts are just constantly shifting around all over the place, right? There's no progression involved. Now, this is what's odd, too, about, a popular group within our day and age that would like to usually, not all, but many would say they label themselves progressives. But many of the same people that would label themselves progressive and that are involved in a lot of these social moral issues also argue that relativism is true. Moral relativism is true. But if moral relativism is true, then what are they progressing towards? Think about that. Pause it if you need to. If moral relativism is true and there is no real right or real wrong for all people, all places, and all times, well, then what are they progressing towards? The easy answer is they're not. They're not progressing. You're just moving. The only way that you can truly be a progressive is to hold to some absolute or objective morality, because then you can progress towards the goal of that ideology, right? You can progress towards the more complete, the more robust, the better end goal there in regards to some sort of moral issue. 6, relativists can't hold meaningful moral discussions. Again, this is just like two, guys sitting around talking about which ice cream flavor is the best. Well, if it's you that determine that, if it's the subject, that's a subjective truth. If it's you that determines that, then it's, again, like two guys sitting around talking about literally arguing about which ice cream flavor is best. Now, anybody watching this conversation says, do these guys not realize that chocolate is perhaps neither any better nor worse than vanilla? It's just he likes chocolate and this guy doesn't, right? There's no sense in trying to argue that the other guy's wrong for not liking the flavor of ice cream that you like. But remember, if moral relativism is true, then what you believe about morality is just like arguing about flavors of ice cream, because it's just your own opinion, right? So they can't even sit around and have in the robust sense of the term, of the meaning of the word, they can't have a robust conversation on moral discussions, right? Now, this is perhaps the golden calf of moral relativism. Remember how one of the things that we said it was supposed to give you was tolerance, right? Hey, look, if I can't impose my morality on you, you can't impose it on me, we each decide our own thing, well then, that helps us tolerate each other. But think about that. Excuse me, push pause, see what's wrong with that. Think about what's wrong with that. Let me give you a second. All right. If I simultaneously hold to the belief that each individual, it's up to themselves to determine what's right or wrong, well then I cannot tell you what? To tolerate my moral view, because again, what if they say, well, tolerance is just right for you. It's not right for me. Well, no, you have to tolerate that. Well, wait a minute, isn't that your moral view? You're telling me that your moral view is tolerance, and that I am supposed to abide by your moral view, which is to tolerate other moral views? Well, what if my moral view says I don't want to tolerate other moral views? What if that's what I think is right? You're trying to impose your morality on me when you say that I have to tolerate other views. That's just your moral position. That's not my moral position. If you want to tolerate other moral views, all right, then go ahead, but I don't. You have to assume that I'm obligated, here's our word, you have to assume that I ought to hold to a moral view that maybe I don't even agree with, that stands outside of my own subjective preference. You see what they're saying? You see the problem? The moral relativist that always likes to run around talking about tolerance can't even, his own view or her own view of moral relativism can't even support the notion of tolerance. It can't even ground that metaphysically or ontologically, because itself says that each moral view is determined by the person. Well, if it's determined by the person, well then I don't have to listen to you say that I have to follow your moral ideology of tolerance. What if that's not mine? Now, this has to do with what we just discussed 2 or 3 slides earlier about relativists can't have moral progress or regress. Again, remember, they're just moving, right? The goalposts are constantly just moving, meaning they can't get any better in their behavior and they can't get any worse, because whatever they decide is good, or whatever they decide is bad, and whatever they decide is good, right? They can't make any progress, right? They can't say, well, I used to behave this way, but now I'm so much better now. Because when they say, well, I did behave this way, but now I'm doing this and it's better, they're assuming some sort of moral standard, right, that their behavior is better when it's judged by that standard, right? But again, they've already said there is no such standard. There's no such absolute or objective moral transcending norms or any of these sorts of things. They've just changed their behavior. It's just changed. It hasn't gotten any better unless there's a real transcendent moral standard that exists that people ought to behave by and ought to judge their behavior by, right? Now, again, we've discussed this previously, just again, same thing a few slides ago. Relativists can't simultaneously, at the same time, argue for rights and moral relativism, right? You can't run around saying that people have rights, blah, 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 and say that moral relativism is true. Why? Well, because maybe it's just your view. Maybe it's just right for you that all these other people have rights. Not me. My view is that the strongest survive, survival of the fittest. That's my moral view. And if you can't survive, if you're not the strongest, then you just can't survive. Well, no. You have to give them their rights. Says who? You? Isn't that just your moral view? Isn't that just your ideology of morality? Or says who? Your grandmother? I don't hold to that view. That may be right for you. That's not right for me. Who are you to judge? Right? Again, think about this. Reducing to the absurd. You can't hold to moral relativism and even argue that people have any sort of intrinsic rights. Now, we looked at this when we talked about the issue of tolerance. In philosophy, there's a concept in regard to the law of non-contradiction that we call self-defeating or self-stultifying or self-retarding or self-referentially incoherent, right? We use those terms, and it just means that it's self-defeating. So it's like saying, I am not speaking in English right now. Well, if I'm speaking in English, it can't be true that I'm not speaking in English. See how the statement just stultifies itself. It's self-defeating. It's self-referentially incoherent. It's referencing in itself in a way that's incoherent. I am not speaking English right now. Yeah, you are. That statement can't possibly be true. So when I say you ought not impose your morality on other people, remember, go back to the Faye Waddleton example that we looked at earlier here. This little article here. Go back to that and look at how she simultaneously argues for all of these things we've gone through about rights, about not imposing your morality on other people, and she's doing exactly what she's saying that you cannot do. So again, let's look at this. You ought not impose your morality. What is that person doing when they say, hey, you watching this right now, you should not impose your morality on other people? What am I doing right now? I'm imposing my moral view on you. When I say you ought not impose your morality on other people, I'm literally at that very moment imposing what I think is right or wrong on you. I'm telling you that you have to abide by my moral position of not imposing your morality on other people. You see how that defeats itself? Well, what? Because look at it. If I say that you can't impose your morality on other people, well, I'm doing exactly what I'm saying that you can't do. I'm imposing my morality on you. So the question is not if we're going to impose our morality on other people. The question is rather, which morality are we going to impose? Are we going to impose a shared morality that all of us should be obeying and should be aligning our actions with? Or are we going to say nonsense that's literally, philosophically, and logically incoherent? This kind of stuff, right? You can't even say, well, look, there's no real rights or wrongs, so you can't impose your morality on other people, because then you can just turn around and say, well, then why are you imposing your morality on me right now? Why are you saying I have to adopt that view? You can't even, again, it's existentially unviable. You can't even live that out. You can't even live out the very saying you can't impose your morality on other people because you're doing it right then. You can't even live the ideology when you say these types of statements. Now, I always put this in here because there's usually at least one or two moral relativists that go through these particular lectures, especially at the public college. So I always kind of put this in here as a tongue-in-cheek kind of joke sort of thing. So relativists can't accuse those that teach against moral relativism of wrongdoing. So what if you were to say, all right, instructor, professor, teacher, this is what you're saying is totally wrong. This is absolute nonsense. You shouldn't be teaching this to people. I can just say, why shouldn't I be teaching it to people? Isn't it your view that the individual determines what's right and wrong for themselves? Isn't it your own view that says, hey, you can't impose your morality on me? That's just your morality. I think this is absolutely fine, and I think it's moral to teach others that moral relativism is terrible. And if you're a moral relativist, you can't say that I'm wrong. Because again, that's just like saying, teacher, instructor, I like carrots. All right, I don't care. I don't care about your personal opinion. Because when you say something like that, again, you see the student is not, they don't think they're actually giving just their opinion. They think they're making a moral claim that everyone else ought to abide by, which defeats the position of moral relativism. Again, it's just incoherent. So, here's some of the highlights of individualistic, or I say, moral relativism. Just an overview of those. You can look through those, right? Just 1 through 6. Now, is there a back door out of this? Is there some way of saying, well, wait a minute. Maybe I can escape this individualistic moral relativism. Maybe there's a way to get out of this. Maybe there's still really no real absolute rights or wrongs that are true for all people at all places at all times in some sense. Maybe I can get out of this. Is there maybe some sort of side door that I can step through that gets me out of these difficulties? And again, these are we're just going through and looking. These are just again highlighting your difficulties here. So before we look at the next, how do you answer that question? Is there maybe some side door to get out of that? What about this? What about if we say, okay, look, it's ridiculous to say that each individual person determines right and wrong for themselves. That's clearly false. That can't be true. But what if our society together, conventionally, right? What if together as a group of people, our culture decides what's right and wrong, and that grounds some sort of right or wrong, even though there's not a real objective or absolute standard of right or wrong. Maybe our culture together, hey, if I think this is wrong and you think this is wrong and he thinks this is wrong, well, then we can coherently say that something really is wrong. All right, so now we're looking at what? Conventionalism, or society says. We just looked at I say relativism. Now we can look at society says relativism. Hate to burst your bubble, it ain't going to work. Let's look at the problems. First, let's look at moral reformers. If your society says, if the greater number of folks in your culture believe that something is right or wrong, and that's what makes it right or wrong, well, hey, look, our culture says this is right or wrong. Our society says this is right or wrong. Well, what do we do with people that disagree with their culture? If your culture or your society says what is right or wrong, well, then you, by definition, are, answer the question, either are moral or immoral if you disagree with your society or culture. If your society or your culture determines what's right or wrong, then what are you, by definition, if you disagree or go against your culture? You, by definition, are immoral. So look at MLK, right, our first example, or Gandhi, right, or the abolitionists. The guy in Tiananmen Square, right? Remember standing in front of the famous picture and standing in front of the tank. All of these people are literally immoral for doing what they did because they went against the conventionalism, society says. They went against what their culture was saying. So if you want to try to argue that society says, or cultural relativism can make something right or wrong, right? Well, our society says that that makes it right. Our culture says that that makes it right or wrong. Well, if you go against the culture, then you, by definition, are the immoral person. You're the problem. So MLK was immoral because he went against his culture, right? That said what was going on at the time was completely fine and okay and acceptable and moral. Gandhi, immoral. right? Maybe he's immoral on other grounds, but in regard to his social issue, immoral, he's going against his culture. The abolitionists, right, who went against their culture at the time. Hey, slavery is wrong. You can't own people. Excuse me. That's wrong. You can't do that. Well, they're going against the culture. Well, then by definition, they are the immoral people. They should have been looked down upon. They should have been punished. Punitive action should have been taken against them. They're wrong. They're going against culture. Now think about this. What if your culture, what if the majority of your culture, or what if your culture just at large says racism is okay, and you think racism is false? Well then, if racism is determined to be okay by your culture and you disagree, well then you are, ironically, the immoral person. Again, we're trying to reduce to the absurd here, right? Or what about gay bashing, right? If the majority of the culture tries to say that's fine, that's okay, it's, you know, that's a good thing to do, and then you say, well, wait a minute, look, you can't just bash people because you disagree with their particular lifestyle. You can't hurt them, right? All right. Well, then now you're the immoral person because you're going against culture. Again, slavery. Say, you know, this is non-women voters. It should say women voters here. But women, if they are not allowed suffrage, if they can't vote, if the culture at large says, hey, they can't vote, and you say, hey, well, that's not fair. Well, if you're a cultural relativist or a conventionalist, you think that society determines what's right or wrong, and you disagree with your society, you think that women should be able to vote, you're the immoral person, right? You could multiply these examples over and over and over. Think about this. Here's your second implication. Your culture or your society has no business in rescuing, improving, helping other cultures or evils, right? So for instance, if Nazi Germany decides to round up 6 million Jews and 6 million non-Jews and just exterminate them, well then that's their culture. Their culture said it's okay and you can't do that, right? You're not allowed to do that. That's wrong for you to do. It's wrong for you to go over there and stop them. Or the Canaanites, when they decide to wipe out all their kids, right? They decide to kill their children, sacrificing their children for whatever reason. It's wrong for that to be stopped. Northern African child sacrifice, so on and so forth, back in the day. I think it was the Carthaginians. I'd have to brush back up on my history there to see which particular culture that was doing such things. Well, if the culture decides that, well then, hey, that's fine. You can't say that, well, it's just their culture that says that's right or wrong. All right, well, hey, look, if it's just their culture, then you don't have any business over there saying that they can't wipe out their kids, they can't practice child sacrifice, they can't round up Jews like the Nazis did, the Jews, the homosexuals, and the gypsies, white, non-Aryan whites. You can't say that. That's just their culture, blah, blah, blah. Now, here's the implication. Here's another irony of this. But really, think about this. Pay attention. This is a paradox of this exact same position. Really, you can't even say that it's wrong to go stop it either. What? Wait a minute. If culture or society says what's right or wrong, well then we can't go and say what they're doing is wrong. Well, what about this? But what if it's another culture or society? What if it's their moral view to go stop or to interfere with other cultures? So you can't even say, well, you know what, we don't have any business going over there because that's their culture. Well, what if my culture says it is our business to go over there? There's no transcendent moral code that you can judge each culture by that allows you to adjudicate between the two cultures, because it's just, again, on your own view, the culture, the society that has decided, the conventionalism, what's right or wrong for the culture. Well, what if it's that culture to go over there and stop things? You see how that contradicts this here? So not only are we getting to absurd conclusions, now we're getting to just contradictory conclusions, right? So think of it this way. Here's an example. Back in the day, in India, part of their cultural practice was to, I think it was called seti. I need to brush back up on my cultural practices here. historical references, but they would burn the widows of a man when he died, right? They would burn the widow on his funeral pyre. It didn't matter if she was 16 or however old she was. If she was his widow, then she would be burned on his funeral pyre. Now, when the British were doing their colonial thing, right, they were all over the place. You know, the saying used to be the sun never sets on the British Empire, and by that it just meant that they were just imperialistic. They were all over the place, colonizing everything, right? When they were over there in that particular culture, they noticed this practice of, again, SETI, I think it's SETI. But anyway, they noticed the practice of these women, these girls, these women being burnt alive on the funeral pyres of their husband if their husband died. Well, they said, hey, you can't do that. You know, we're not going to allow you to burn up otherwise innocent women in fires just because their husband dies. Well, one of the arguments, among others, that was given was, hey, this is our culture. You can't tell us that we can't burn up our widows because this is our culture. Well, without missing a beat, apparently one of the leaders of the British, again, apparently without missing a beat, said, all right, well, that's fine. If that's what you want your argument, but if you want to ground your argument in it's that your culture, so you should be allowed to do that, well, then you know what? If it's your culture to burn up widows when they die, it's our culture to hang you around the neck until you're dead for doing that. So if you want your argument to be, well, it's our culture, so we can therefore burn up widows, well, I can say, well, it's our culture to hang you around the neck until you die for burning up widows. Because you know what? That's our culture. In our culture, we kill men, we punish men for burning up women. You see how that backfires? If you try to use, well, it's our culture, it's my society that does this, so it's okay, well, then the person can turn around and say, well, all right, it's my society to stop your society. My cultural morality is to stop other cultures in regard to their morality, whatever their moral view is. And again, if there's no transcendent standard above cultures, no objective or absolute moral code above those cultures to adjudicate between them, well, then you can't say that they're wrong for doing what they're doing because they're just doing what their culture says to do, which is to stop your culture, right? Now, what if you have two opposing cultures that clash with opposite values? Again, we've just mentioned this. What if one culture says women should be stoned if they try to vote, and another culture says women should be applauded when they vote? You can't say which culture's better. You can say which cultures are better according to your own opinion, but you can't say there's a real moral, transcendent moral standard that you're saying, well, this culture is more in line with that moral standard than this culture is. Again, because if you're a cultural relativist, if you're a moral relativist, either individualistic or cultural, you've erased that standard. You say it doesn't exist, it's just determined by either the person or it's determined by the culture. Well, if it's determined by the culture culture that decides to stone women for trying to vote is just as quote-unquote moral, if that's what their culture says, as the culture that says, no, we applaud women when they go and vote, right? There's nothing to judge between the two. You literally can't even try to say one is better than the other outside of what you think your own, it's just whatever your opinion or the consensus of your own culture is. There's no moral standard for you to judge by. Now, some of these, again, you can go back through and highlight those points of the, I say, individualistic relativism and the cultural type of or conventionalistic type of relativism. But are there some objections to this? Sure. So let's just look at one or two real quickly, because basically you can apply this principle to almost any objection you hear. But what if someone says, but look, we know that our morality changes. And I'm going to use a classic example that even C.S. Lewis addressed, well over half a century ago. Somebody might give the example, say, look, we know our morality changes. Look at the witch trials. People went around, burning up witches or hanging witches. We don't do that anymore. So clearly our moral views have changed, right? Our moral views have clearly changed because people do not go around now put women on trial for witchcraft and either hang them or burn them up, right? But C.S. Lewis makes a very important observation, and he says it roughly like this, that this confuses the instance of the fact with the principle, or sometimes called it's a fact value, a failure to distinguish between a fact value distinction, or a fact with the principle. Lewis says this, he roughly says, look, nothing changed in regard to why these particular individuals were punished. They were punished, perhaps wrongly, because they thought that they were either murdering, they were directly involved with murdering people, or indirectly involved with murdering people, innocent people, or harming innocent people, either directly or indirectly. Do we still punish people that we believe are either directly or indirectly murdering people, responsible for murder, or either directly or indirectly responsible for harming people? Do we still punish people for that? Yeah. The moral principle never changed. They thought that these people were either harming or murdering innocents, or harming innocents, and they punished them. Again, perhaps wrongly. But we still punish people, even perhaps wrongly, that we think are responsible either directly or indirectly for murdering innocents or harming people. So what changed then? The moral principle didn't change. What changed was people just don't believe that witches have that, either they don't believe witches exist, or they don't think that witches actually have the power to harm or murder people. The moral principle never changed. We still, just as they did, initiate punitive action against people that we think harm innocent individuals. That's what they were doing. They were wrong in regard to their belief about whether witches have the power to do such a thing. But the moral principle is exactly the same, right? Now, that's just one example, but you could make your own, easily make your own examples here. Now, look at this next. Moreover, if that's your argument, look, our morality does change. Look at witches and all this kind of stuff. You can't say it's any better now. Again, because now we're going to go right back to all of those same objections we had a minute ago, earlier in the slides about either I say individualistic relativism. Well, who are you to say that they were wrong for that? They say they're right, you say they're wrong. Doesn't matter, just your opinion. Or even cultural. Well, hey, their culture said it's right, your culture says it's wrong, neither one is any better than the other, because there's no standard by which to judge by. So even if the principle changed, which it didn't, as we've already illustrated pretty easily, but even if it did, you still don't even have the luxury to say that they were immoral for doing so, if you are either a I say relativist or a cultural relativist. You still don't have the luxury to say that what they did was any more immoral than what you do. Again, because it's determined by the person or the culture. So that really doesn't leave you any footing to stand on as a moral relativist. Again, another example. What about something, skipping down here, look at your slide again. What about something like September 11th? They think it's absolutely right. They thought it was absolutely moral, correct, a good thing to fly a building to fly planes into a building and kill a bunch of people. We thought that was absolutely immoral. They thought that was absolutely moral. They thought it was absolutely right. We thought it was absolutely wrong. See, these cultures have completely different moral codes. Again, just think about it. The moral principle is exactly the same. Their view in their culture, right? Osama bin Laden thinks it's wrong to what? To murder innocent people. We think it's wrong to murder innocent people. Here is the fact, right? The failure to distinguish the fact. They didn't think what? That the citizens of the United States were innocent. So you see, both societies think that it's immoral to harm people who aren't doing anything wrong, who are innocents. They just disagreed on who was innocent, right? They said, well, look, the Americans aren't innocent, therefore we can do this to them, right? The United States was not innocent, therefore we can do this action to them. Well, how do we know that that's the difference? Because think, if you were to fly your planes into their buildings, they would be outraged, right? Why? Because they clearly don't think it's wrong to punish wrongdoers because they have already done that. They just think that they're not wrong, right? So you see the failure to distinguish, the principle is exactly the same. Both cultures think that it's wrong to hurt innocent people. Each culture is just trying to say that each one of them are innocent, right? Both think that murder, which just by definition is the taking of life of an innocent, is wrong. They both think that. They just don't think the other was innocent. That's where the argument lies. The argument doesn't lie with the moral principle. The moral principle remains the same. Again, how do you know? Fly a plane into one of those buildings, right? And they would be outraged according to whether they're innocent or guilty, right? The moral principle remains. Now, this is our last thought experiment. This is a very powerful film, very short film, put on by, made by a guy named Brian Godawa. He's a filmmaker, and he introduced this film called Cruel Logic. And what this does is he just goes through arguments, and you'll see very dramatic. So, in fact, let me just go ahead and say this. If you've got little ones in the room or you're a little apprehensive, be aware that this is pretty strong, and it's strong on purpose because C.S. Lewis likes to say that sometimes the best way to recognize a truth is to put it in the form of fiction, meaning you don't the truth is not fiction, but you fictionalize an account that contains that truth, because when we are listening to a story or when we're enraptured in a story or in a cinematic piece, a movie, a novel, whatever, it can hit, the truth about something can hit us in a fresh way because we don't have our intellects, as Lewis said, guarding the gates, right? It can just kind of hit us in a fresh way, and it helps us to realize a truth that's sitting there before us. So I want you to watch this. Let me give you a little background. Suppose there's a professor and there's a bad guy, right? You'll pick this up very quickly. But there's a professor that's basically been arguing that bad behavior, criminal behavior, immoral behavior is just simply the result of your genetic disposition, right? So basically, he's arguing for moral relativism because of, just our genetic, the way we're made, our biology. Watch how the bad guy argues against that in a very scary manner. So let's watch that very quickly. Again, this is Brian Godawa, very talented filmmaker in this regard. This is his work. And I'll leave you with these thoughts.
Wakey, wakey. Hello, Dr. Pomeranke. I heard your lecture tonight at the college on criminal biology. DNA, instinct, and aggression. It's a well thought out presentation, but a bit abstract. Too academic, if you ask me. What I want to know is, have you ever really lived out your theory? Or are you content writing your papers inside your ivory tower, torturing your captive audience of students with your intellectual posturing?
What do you want from me?
I'm here to test your hypothesis. You're a sociobiologist, are you not?
Yes.
Well, in your lecture, you argued for the genetic origins of crime. Biology determines behavior. Well, I'd like to debate you on that.
What do you mean debate?
You know, dialectic. I make a proposition, you counter, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Only in this debate, the stakes are real. If you win, I let you go. If I win, that's part of the proposition.
What proposition?
The issue resolved. There is no valid reason why I should not kill you. Debating for the negative, Professor Pomeroy. And for the affirmative, yours truly.
You are gonna kill me. Please. Please. I'll do anything. Anything you say.
Stimulus, response.
Please don't kill me.
Give me one good reason.
It's illegal. Murder's illegal. You'll go to jail.
I don't plan on being caught.
But it's wrong to kill.
Professor, don't go getting all moral on me. You said that our DNA determines our behavior. DNA has no morality.
It's abnormal. Your DNA is abnormal.
Abnormality has to do with statistical averages, Professor, not right or wrong.
Society agrees killing is wrong.
Society is another word for statistical average. We're not all from the same gene pool, you know.
That doesn't make it right.
And it doesn't make it wrong.
Our species won't survive if we allow killing.
You mean you won't survive? I will. Me. In my DNA.
You're a sick man. Your mind is diseased.
Correction. I'm a genetically determined man with a biological predisposition toward aggression. Killing is in my genes, all according to your theory. Which brings us back to the central question.
Please.
If all that I am is genetically determined, why should I not in fact kill you, when I am scientifically bound by my DNA to do so?
Please have mercy. Take pity, I beg you.
There's no mercy or pity in these genes.
Please.
I'm a predator. By nature.
No. Please, I beg you. Please.
Beggars can't be choosers, Professor. Low survival rate. And I think it's time you learn your lesson. Ideas, you see, have consequences.
All right. So, powerful little illustration, right? You may have to watch that a few times to get the import. Moral relativism is wrong. It's false. It leads to ridiculous conclusions. It leads to absurd conclusions and even possibly contradictory conclusions. Be ready for our next discussion as we go through our course here in ethics. Thanks for watching. See you next time.